website. So, we only have one more meeting this year, and after tonight, next month, and our guest speaker will be Sam Doering, and his topic he's called "Don't Argue with Germans." It sort of sounds a bit of a lofty type statement. Sam is a young man, he's only in his mid-20s, and he's really a very dynamic historian in many ways. He lives at Neil's Flat on a farm with his brother, but he's not a farmer. He's a tour guide at Anlaby Station. He's involved with the Udunda Heritage Group, and he's a member of other organisations historically linked around the state. He's the author of 2 publications so far, and the first one, The Diary of Emily Apple, he was a guest speaker here some time back. And he's also a speaker on a whole range of historical topics, and including the one tonight. A few weeks ago, I attended a JP's meeting. I'm a Justice of the Peace, and we had the meeting at Udunda, and Samuel was our guest speaker, and he introduced us to, you might say, 10 unique things about the German population in South Australia, and we added to it a bit as well. First thing that was particularly German that he identified was Rote Grütze. Have you ever heard of it? Yeah. Typical German Barossa thing. They even have a category in Tanunda show for it. And Kitchener buns is also another German invention. But he also made mention of some of the people that Ben Hollister mentioned in his presentation about architects in Adelaide, jewellers, silversmiths, and the Botanic Gardens. But then he sort of also referred to German cabinet makers, particularly in the Barossa, German newspapers, that both state and church papers, and we suggested he could add German pipe organ builders, Julius Henschke is a sculptor, German small goods that sort of Barossa is typical for. So he's giving further talks and he's going to expand it to other things. But next time he's giving a talk about the 3 Lutheran churches at Neil's Flat. For those of you who don't know where Neil's Flat is, it's between Truro and Udunda, about 3/4 of the way up to Udunda, and off to the right on a parallel road, probably 1 kilometre or 2 away from the highway. And he'll be talking about why there were 3 Lutheran churches on that site, and you would have seen a picture of it in the newsletter, and even the problems they had sharing a cemetery between the 3 of them. And then there's another Lutheran church just down the road, 4 or 5 kilometres away, the St Stephen's Church, also at Neil's Flat. So it's a curiosity thing, and in those early times when people had disagreements, they seem to have gone off and built another church, as happened in some of the other places in the Barossa and beyond. But this is a curious one where there's 3 churches on the same property. And so it'll be an interesting presentation. During History Month this year, he gave a talk at Neil's Flat about those 3 churches. And he was limited to 50 or 60 people at a session in the Neil's Flat Church. He eventually finished up with 4 different sessions. Over 230 people came to listen to his presentation. And Neil's Flat has probably got a population of about 20. So there was a lot of people who had forebears in that region that were interested, and I think there's been more people since then that have shown interest. And so it was a really topical subject, and we thought it might be topical for here as well, but we had to get in quickly because he originally intended to go to Germany later this year to do a year or more of further studies. He did some studies in England in his teenage years, but with all his work that's going on around him, and he was also a rural ambassador entrant for the Royal Adelaide Show, and he was a runner-up in that, and that was announced at the show lately, and he felt that all these things meant that he had to sort of stay here until next year sometime. So we tried to get in quickly before he does leave our shores to do further study. So we hope that you might enjoy this topic, a topic that's different in some ways, particularly with 3 churches in very close proximity in a very small rural area. So I commend it to you, and it's on Thursday the 17th of October here. Now, with tonight's meeting, I think it's also appropriate, particularly with the topic, that we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land in which we meet tonight, and also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So, I'll call on Lois now to introduce briefly our 2 speakers.
Thank you, Jeff, and good evening to our audience here tonight. It's a great pleasure to introduce Peter Monteath for, I don't know how many times he's been introduced to Friends of Lutheran Archives. It's 2 decades since he first engaged with significant documents at Lutheran Archives and presented an exhibition, Dear Dr. Janzo, and a book and a talk to FoLA and an article in the FoLA journal. And since then he has also presented on similar topics to do with modern European, German and also Australian history, such as prisoners of war and internment. Always very interesting topics to follow up. And but as well as that, he has taken a very deep interest in the presence of Germans here in South Australia. You will also know him for his 2 books he has edited. The translation of Friedrich Gerstekker's travels in Australia with several chapters on South Australia, and the book Germans that follows a wide range, comprehensive range of deeply researched specialist articles on various aspects of the German presence here in South Australia. So he's well known to us and always very welcome, and it's very interesting to hear this new project where he is joined by a colleague of his from Flinders University. Peter is, as well as a lecturer, a professor of modern history there at Flinders. He is the executive dean of the humanities faculty as well, and a colleague in the history area, international history, is Dr. Matthew Fitzpatrick. They have worked together in the past on such things as presenting international conferences on the German presence, all around the world in imperialism, nationalism, topics of that sort. And they have also recently presented a conference here, again international, with international guest speakers on the relationship, the interactions between the British and the Germans in various parts of the world where they have happened to be in the same place. So It's great to have Matt join us here for the first time to share their new project here, looking at what German writers here have said about their interactions with the Indigenous people they encountered or observed here in South Australia. Matt also is very active. He has received many fellowships and awards, and he's also very active in the history sphere on boards and committees, and he is at present president of South Australia's History Council, a position that Peter Monteath held previously. And so Matt was responsible for handing to our next month's speaker, Sam Doering, the award as Emerging Historian of the Year at the presentation of those awards a few months ago here for 2024. So both of them are very well versed in the German background, the German presence in Australia and around the world, and they will reveal a new aspect of that story to us tonight. So please welcome Peter Monteath and Matt Fitzpatrick.
And I hope you can hear me. Is that microphone doing its job? That's good, thank you. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and I've taken to, in these circumstances, using some Kaurna words, Nyadlu Tampanti Kaurna Yata Matnya Wama Tandanyaku, which means something like we know, we acknowledge the Kaurna people as the owners of the land of the red kangaroo. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you to Jeff and to Lois for the introduction. This is the first time that Matt and I have got to talk about this book because it's fresh off the press. We are not planning to do a launch, so this in a sense is in lieu of a launch. It's our very first presentation, so exciting for us, and we also think it's very appropriate that we do it to such a group as this. What better group to talk about this piece of German Australian history than FoLA. So what we plan to do is a kind of double act. I'll talk for a little while. I have a few thank yous to say, and then I'm going to hand over to Matt for the second half of the presentation. But thank you very much for the opportunity to present our book to you. As for those words of thanks that I want to express this evening, first of all, they do go to FoLA. They go to Lutheran Archives and to Lois in particular. And that's because they have allowed us access to the archives, and that's one of the most important repositories for the kind of project that we have undertaken here. We were very ably guided, as always, by Lois, and very capably helped by others as well. Ben Hollister, who's here, of course, this evening, Angela Schilling, and Rachel Kuschel. All of this were invaluable in their contributions as they guided us through the collection. Not only that, but there are a number of people involved with the archives who contributed unwittingly. We've used in this book a number of texts that were already in translation in the Lutheran Archives. There were translations by Marcus Krieg, Jeff Noller, Eric Meyer, and Greg Lockwood. Greg is here this evening, and both Greg and Christine gave us some very valuable advice as we were working on the book. Matt and I worked in the archives, but we also had a couple of people who helped us with that archival work. Carissa Curder and Lisa Mudge were a great help to both of us. Someone who couldn't be here this evening, but I do want to thank him, and that's Dennis O'Brien. Dennis is a colleague of Matt's and of mine. He works with us in the Indigenous Studies discipline at Flinders University. Some of you might know his grandfather, Uncle Lewis, or perhaps his uncle, Uncle Mickey. Dennis, for a time, studied anthropology at the University of Adelaide. He came to Flinders probably 3 or 4 years ago. He's working on a PhD there. And he helped us with this project by giving us advice. We felt that for this topic we needed some cultural advice from an Indigenous man who knows the area intimately. But we'd like to think that it was a mutually beneficial arrangement because, as you'll see if you read Dennis's foreword to the book, he recognised the value of turning to these German sources so that he can go about exploring the history of the Kaurna people through that colonial period. So in his absence, many thanks to Dennis. Now, most of the chapters in this collection are translations, and so I need to thank the translators. Lois is one of them. So there are some pieces in the book that come from translations from fairly recent publications, some older publications as well. Lois, some years ago, did some of the translation of articles written by Hermann Köhler, who's one of the authors represented in the collection. Lee Kirsten had done a translation of the work of Captain Hahn, whom you know from The Zebra. Thomas Kruckemeyer did a couple of chapters from the Gerstecker book that Lois mentioned just a little while ago. Lothar and Heidi Brassey have been working for some time on a translation of a book by Gustav Listermann from the early 1850s and made available to us the translation that they had done of the chapter in that book about Listermann's impressions of Indigenous South Australians. That still leaves a number of other chapters that needed translation for the first time, and most of that work was done by Harold and Aileen Ohlendorf, and I think they're online. They're living in Braunschweig, in Brunswick, in Germany at the moment. So if you're listening, Harold and Aileen, many thanks for your massive contribution to this project. So the work on this was a combination of research work. It was finding the text that we wanted to use, and then in almost all cases it was translation work. That work was funded in very large part by an organisation called the Yitpi Foundation. Yitpi is a Kaurna word meaning seed or soul, and it was Jane Rathjen from the Yitpi Foundation who made the funding available to us. Matt and I had corresponded with Jane over years. This has taken quite a while. It's been a long gestation period. And we met Jane for the first time just a few days ago, and we're very happy finally to be able to hand over the book to her. And Matt might say a little bit more later. His contribution is financed in part by an ARC, an Australian Research Council fund. Stephen Graham suggested to us the use of the cover image that you see on the slide, on this first slide, that is, of course, the cover of the book. In the advertisement for this evening's event, there's an earlier version of this Alexander Schramm painting. For our purposes, we took Stephen's advice and went for this one. It's a little bit later, so it's dated, I think, 1859, generally known as Bush Visitors. I know there's a range of views on who might be depicted here, but the key thing for us was that it depicts an encounter between Indigenous people and possibly Germans, but I know Philip has his own views about this as well, I think, but the key thing for us was this tableau, if you like, of a cross-cultural encounter. Michael Deaves at Wakefield did the cover and set the text for us, so thanks to him, but biggest thanks of all to Michael Bolin, who is the publisher at Wakefield Press, and we're very grateful to him for taking on this project. So what are we trying to do with the collection? I don't think we were responding specifically to the Uluru Statement and its injunction to engage in truth-telling, but I think that's the spirit in which we offer this book. I think in reality for historians, but for others in Australia over recent years, there's been a focus on this question of race relations in Australia. There's been an awful lot of work done already. There's an awful lot of work happening as we speak. Matt and I thought we can, in a modest way, contribute to that work, and above all by adding a German perspective to this question of the frontier. So we started looking for chapters to collect together. We were interested primarily in sustained descriptions, so not just in passing references by Germans to Indigenous Australia, but we were looking for works which involved detailed description, which were based on genuine engagement, preferably over some period of time. We were interested in both published and unpublished works. We were interested in South Australia, although there was a time when our logic was, well, South Australia for the last decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century did include also the Northern Territory. So in fact, at the beginning, we started collecting texts from the Northern Territory as well, but then decided that would make it simply too big. But we have in the backs of our minds the idea that maybe that would be a sequel, depending on how we run with this one. We were interested in what might be broadly described as the colonial period. So the first person curler whose writings we've collected here was in Adelaide in the late 1830s, and then the final text in the collection is from, I think, 1928, so it's roughly 100 years that we cover. We have added an introduction to the book, but we decided that for the best part we just let these texts speak for themselves. Having said that, we're very aware of the cultural sensitivities around this. The views expressed here are views of their time. We didn't want to include in the collection material that would offend sensibilities, and that's where we drew in particular on the advice from Dennis O'Brien, and where he suggested that there were things that were best omitted. We, of course, omitted them. We were interested in contributions by Germans, as the title suggests, but Germans as a term encompasses a great diversity of people. A geographical diversity, so these were people who came from many parts of Germany, and of course in the mid-19th century there was no united Germany yet. So of course there were people who came from Prussia, but then equally there were people who came from parts of western, southern Germany as well. People who remained in Australia for various or varied periods of time, so some were just passing through, they were travellers, but others spent the best part of their lives here in Australia. In terms of religion, yes, there are Lutherans well represented in the collection, but they're not all Lutherans. There are Catholics as well, and there's one person I'll talk about in a moment who was of Jewish heritage. And their motivation was varied. They observed Indigenous Australians for lots of different reasons, engaged with them for a variety of reasons. And to illustrate that diversity, what I might do is, I can't make that work. Are you able at the back there to shift that to the next slide for me? Thank you. We've got 4 headings. The first is sojourners and immigrants, and these are the writers collected under that heading. Hermann Köhler, I mentioned before, was here in 1837, 1838. He was a ship's doctor. Dirk Meinitz-Hahn, you know, was captain of the Zebra famously and took those settlers to Hahndorf, named after him. Friedrich Gerstecker, that's Gerstecker in the image there, and that's an image of him, I think, from roughly that time. One of the great travel writers of the 19th century, quite prolific. He visited Australia as he was touring the world. He crossed the Pacific from first south and then North America. He travelled down the Murray on a canoe until it sank, and then he walked the Murray Valley until finally he reached his destination here in Adelaide, and he, in his book, describes encounters with Indigenous people in Victoria and in South Australia. This was written at a time when there were lots of works being published in Germany which in essence were advertising Australia as a destination for immigrants, and many of them painted a very positive image, but the outlier is Gustav Listermann. In his book from 1851, basically his message was, don't come. He stayed for a while but then returned to Germany with his family. Emil Jung was a school inspector for quite some time in South Australia. He lived in Australia for over 20 years, and as part of his role as a school inspector, he travelled widely in South Australia. And then if we can move to the next slide. The missionaries. And it'll be no surprise to any of you that the so-called Dresden Four are very well represented there. Teichelmann, Schurman, Klose, Meyer. The images there are of Teichelmann and Schurman. I hesitate a little bit to use them, and this is a point that Lois has made before. They're a little misleading because when they came to Australia they were young men, and we have these images of them as much older men, but most of the people represented here, they were in their 20s and 30s, but we don't always have images of them from that time. The outlier is Strelo. I think we felt an obligation to include the mercurial figure of Karl Strelo, but it's not a description of the Indigenous people at Hermannsburg, but rather it's an article that he published in an Adelaide newspaper in 1921. And then the next slide, please. Geographers and naturalists. Hans Hermann Baer was a botanist and entomologist. He travelled for some time through South Australia. Wilhelm von Blandowski was also here as well as in Victoria for quite some time. A man of many intellectual interests across a range of scientific disciplines. The same goes for Charles Wilhelmy, essentially a plant collector, but with a variety of interests as well, and who spent quite a bit of time on the west coast, on the Eyre Peninsula, was guided to a large extent by Schumann, who was there as sub-protector for some time while Wilhelmy visited him. And then the images of Georg von Neumayer, famous in Germany perhaps primarily as a hydrographer. He became a very prominent scientific figure in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century, but earlier in his life he'd spent a number of years in Australia, both in South Australia but primarily in Victoria. And finally, the fourth category, if we could move over to the next slide, anthropologists and ethnologists. First one in that section is Wilhelm Krause. Krause was a craniologist, and we wanted to include Krause because there's a branch of anthropology in Germany which we would describe as physical anthropology. And Krause was a representative of that discipline. In German, the word Anthropologie means physical anthropology, whereas Völkerkunde or Ethnographie is cultural anthropology. So Krause was from that branch of thinking, and he came to Adelaide. You'll see if you read that chapter that he spent some time in the South Australian Museum, which had a very rich collection of skulls, and that was what drew him to that institution. And then Erhard Eilmann, represented in that image there. I believe that's in Hermannsburg. He spent some time at Hermannsburg, staying as a guest of Strelo, although the two men didn't get on at all. It's quite, I think, almost eccentric figure. He arrived first in Adelaide in 1896, and then he spent a long time travelling by train, on horseback and on foot to Darwin, and then all the way back. And then he walked down to the southeast and across the border into Victoria. He left Australia then, but returned a year later and travelled to Kilolpanina, to the Bethesda mission, and spent some time there. And then he returned to Australia again in 1912, 1913. So he was an Australophile, if there is such a thing. And he wrote a mammoth book, several hundred pages, about the natives of the colony of South Australia. That's its title. But we've chosen an extract from a journal that he kept. So Matt retrieved that from the Overseas Museum in Bremen, where his papers are kept, and that's what we've translated and reproduced for our volume. And then the last one is, in many regards, the most unusual. So Leonhard Adam was of Jewish heritage. He was a legal scholar, but with a particular interest in what might be called primitive law. And to illustrate this one a little further, I might get you to move to the next slide. So on the left of this slide is a Ngarrindjeri man called Roland Carter from Rauken, who, as you can see, was a soldier in the First World War. He was captured on the Western Front, and he was taken to a POW camp outside Berlin called Wunsdorf, as were many colonial soldiers from various powers. And in that camp, they were studied by anthropologists, and Leonhard Adam was one of those anthropologists who went into the camp and made studies of these men who were collected there as prisoners of war. But one of the interesting features of this story is that, that Carter returned to South Australia, continued living then at Bralcan. Adam, because he was Jewish, lost his job in 1933, moved to the United Kingdom, and then in 1940 was transported to Australia as one of the Dunera boys. And when he was in Australia, he took up contact again with Roland Carter, whom he wrote to and described as a friend. So that's one of the most unusual contributions. There were two Indigenous men, Carter and a Queensland man by the name of Douglas Grant. But we've extracted from Adam's piece, which he wrote for a journal of law, the descriptions of his conversations with Roland Carter. So that's in overview what you'll find in this collection. The pieces do speak to each other to some extent. Some of these people knew each other or they read each other's work, but we're not dealing here with some kind of German echo chamber where it's just Germans talking to Germans, because especially in the 19th century, Germans were being read by Anglo ethnographers, and so there was an openness, all working together, if you like, in the service of Western knowledge about Australia and its people. But of course that spirit of collaboration largely disappeared at the end of the 19th century with the decline in relations between the British Empire and Germany, and that reached its culmination then with the First World War. And it does mean that there is, to this day, this body of material stemming from the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, which is still largely unknown to us, and Matt and I are hoping that through this project we're making it available again for the benefit of all those who might find some interest in it. And I'm going to hand over now to Matt.
Okay, that's a bit too close. I'll put it down there and see how we go. So yeah, I'd like to firstly thank you all for coming tonight. It's really great of the Friends of the Lutheran Archive to host us tonight. We're really pleased to be able to talk about the book for the first time here. I'd like to, of course, thank the Lutheran Archive as well for their help in putting together some of this book. Thanks, of course, to Peter for guiding me through some of this. He's far more well-versed in the South Australian context than I am, and so it was a real learning experience for me actually working alongside him on this project. The Yippee Foundation and of course the ARC were both important for funding. Of course, I have to mention here too, and quite rightly, that we're here tonight on Gunna Yara, on the lands of the Gunna people. And I think one of the things we wanted to point out, and if we could go to the next slide, please, is that what we're looking at here is the interface, I suppose, of two places that exist on the same terrain. On the one hand, we're looking at Adelaide, the beginnings of Adelaide, but we're also looking at Tandanya, that is to say the indigenous space that had existed since time immemorial here in this land. And so the city's European name, of course, commemorates a German royal, Adelheid von Sachsen-Meiningen, and who was later, of course, Queen Adelaide of the United Kingdom and Hanover. But the land upon which that European city was built is and was Tandanya, the name given to the area by the Gunna, the custodians and traditional owners of the land, whose culture and language marked the region for the kind of 20 millennia prior to the arrival of the Europeans. So I think in some ways, if we can imagine the space that this book covers as kind of overlaying and overlapping, simultaneously kind of imagined geographies as well as physical geographies. So that's one of the things we wanted to point out in this book. Now, not only did, of course, the Kaurna people, but all of South Australia's Indigenous people found themselves and their country knitted into what became a British settler colony, and that is then the nation state of Australia. And so even those Aboriginal nations that were living well beyond the bounds of kind of settlement, and particularly at the very beginning, were declared to be subjects of the British Crown, and their laws were simply set aside, as many of us know, as being quote-unquote too savage to be recognised as law, an injustice that is only now being addressed. Now, I think what we try and think about in the 21st century is, I guess, the enormity of these events. And I think that's still kind of sinking in for the settler population of Australia. But, you know, these histories are, you know, and difficult histories, difficult facts about the processes and extent of dispossession are coming more clearly into view, I think, presently. It remains very difficult in some ways to summon up a mental picture of the kind of the grave historical realities that sit behind the city of Adelaide. And if you walk down, you know, North Terrace or through Rundle Mall, it's the kind of the shape and rhythms of Kaurna country prior to the long process of dispossession becoming increasingly difficult to imagine. And I hope in some way we can kind of offer or contribute kind of a sense of when Tandanya looks somewhat differently. Because we have to remember that less than 200 years ago, this entire space and the entire state of South Australia was unmistakably Indigenous. Now, of course, wresting this territory from Indigenous people was, at least in part, a violent process. And most shocking, of course, were those incidents of physical violence that are known, and we can read about those in a number of books that have been written and published by Wakefield Press, to be honest. But not to be overlooked as well, I think, is the kind of the epistemic violence that went alongside this, now, which is, I guess, a fancy way of saying that, I guess, the religious, cosmological, intellectual frameworks within which Indigenous people had lived for millennia were also problematised and in many cases disrupted, even destroyed by the processes of colonisation. And retrieving these kind of frameworks has been the project of many First Nations people presently, and it requires painstaking work. And I guess in a bitter irony, as many of you would know, of course, the Indigenous record was so effectively obscured in South Australia that the process of reclaiming culture and language has required really a careful reading of the records left by settler colonists, again, and reading them against the grain, of course. And that, of course, includes reading the works of missionaries that, as you all know so well, had assiduously recorded the language and culture of local people in great detail, of course for their own reasons, but nonetheless that has become an immensely important record. So deep immersion in colonial materials has proved itself indispensable to the processes of Indigenous cultural reconstruction, and we hope that this kind of process of cultural reconstruction can be in some modest way assisted by some of the material we have here. Because, of course, many of these missionaries, but also anthropologists and settlers, were of German origin. And this is a fairly basic fact that, again, everybody in this room would know very, very well, but it's quite often overlooked. And particularly many of my colleagues who were Australianists were astonished to find that there were so many writings by Germans that dated back to this period. Of course, histories of Australian colonisation have traditionally focused on the central role of Britain and the British Empire. And that kind of, in some ways, one-dimensional view of the process of colonisation, which Neil Ferguson calls it Anglo-globalisation, so Anglo-globalisation, I think in some ways is something we want to kind of problematise here. We peel back this image of South Australia as simply just another British colony, another British settler colony in a predominantly British colonial world, and in some ways try and think about what other communities were involved in this settler colonial project. I mean, many of you will be aware of the works that Peter and others have done on the role of Germans in this process. But of course there are new works coming out all the time that are looking at the role that the Chinese have played, that Afghans played, and that other communities have played, South Asian communities have played in the early years of Australia and indeed South Australia. So one of the things we're keen to point out once again, and through the writings point out very firmly, is that Germans were really thick on the ground in South Australia's colonisation, and that these Germans had, of course, quite different experiences. So that is to say, we want to make sure that, of course, that on the one hand, the settler colonial project is seen as a multicultural project. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that it is made very clear that this multicultural settler colonial project also intersected very heavily with the Indigenous communities that they came into contact with on the frontier, and indeed who lived in this area. So this kind of triangular relationship between the British on the one hand, other migrant populations such as the Germans, and Indigenous communities on the other, that's the kind of thing I guess we're mapping here. The book, of course, shouldn't be seen as a kind of an incontestable history of the First Nations of South Australia. That would be our worst nightmare, frankly, because many of the things we have here are misunderstandings and rough categorisations made by people who are moving in and out of the colony very hastily. It's a collection of representations and misrepresentations of Indigenous people and their lives, made by German migrants. So that is to say, scientists, missionaries, and sojourners, the people that Peter has just talked about. As Peter's also mentioned, many of the descriptions that are documented in the book are frankly shockingly racist, and there'll be, in some ways, the only way you can justify putting them into print is by pointing out that far too often the virulent racism that permeated colonial Australia has been kind of diluted or has been hidden from view. And in some ways, I think we found it, and I think Dennis agreed with us as well, that it's only by studying the colonial past in all its kind of raw and ugly complexity that, with attention to the specific context within racism operated, that we can kind of move towards the kind of localised truth-telling and that the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart recommended. And that is to say that when we think about truth-telling, we should be really trying to think about it as geographically bounded and grounded. That is to say that we're looking at the relationship between people, not just between the state and a kind of amorphous group that are referred to as Indigenous people, but rather individuals and nations talking to one another. So if we didn't present this kind of painful evidence of past racism, which extended, of course, not beyond the British into the German community, then that would make the historical mistreatment of Indigenous Australians somehow inexplicable. We wouldn't understand where problems had come from if we just simply included all of the things that were very cheery or alternatively, kind of well-meaning in their demeanour. So we had to bring, that is to say, the good along with the bad when we put this together. So if I can just go to the next slide very briefly, I just want to shift to some of the other dimensions of the book that I guess hover in the background, and we deliberately, in some ways, we didn't discuss these apart from in the introduction, but we just wanted to let you know that there is a context within which some of this sits that historians are interested in. So one of the things you might kind of expect from a source collection like this devoted to the specifically German complexion of frontier interactions with Indigenous Australians relates to some of the questions of continuity that historians of Germany have been interested in. That is to say, one of the big themes presently is the extent to which the German experience of colonialism carried over then into later periods of racism, genocide. So colonial racism and colonial violence, whether in Australia or in one of Germany's overseas colonies, has gained its significance for some people and some historians as kind of evidence of what Hannah Arendt called the boomerang effect. That is to say that the violence that went out to the colonies revisited Germany itself at a later period. Now, I think it's a very compelling and interesting idea, but I think in some ways there are a few problems with treating colonial violence in this way. And I won't go into great detail about this, except to say that I'm worried about the kind of mining events on the colonial frontier to serve merely as a prelude to later, quote unquote, important European events. I think that the central importance of those events to Australia and indeed to South Australia needs to be stressed. So I think discussions and descriptions of Indigenous Australians, particularly those of late colonial period anthropologists, might of course find their echoes in later racial science during the Nazi period, but looking for kind of, if you like, a blueprint for later German violence in the colonial experience, I think is fraught with danger. The other thing to say, of course, is that there is I guess to finish off on that point, I think it would be a disservice to Indigenous Australians and indeed to the Germans that we have here if we were to simply to deploy what they say in kind of German debates about what happened in the mid-20th century in Germany. I think far more urgent for us, at least in this project, was the extent to which the Australian experience of colonial relations and kind of the way in which they thought about these things facilitated and critiqued violence and dispossession here in the period that they were active. The other thing, of course, the other context is the discussions that are going on in Australia and indeed elsewhere about the nature of settler colonialism itself, which is a very fraught field, and I won't take you through a blow-by-blow of all of the charges and countercharges related to the nature of settler colonialism, except to say that for some, Patrick Wolfe, Lorenzo Veracini, others, there's been a sense that the logic of kind of displacement and dispossession was intrinsically and inescapably eliminatory. That is to say that elimination of Indigenous people was always going to be the end game. That is to say that they saw written into the DNA of settler colonialism a kind of, sort of an inescapably genocidal trajectory. Now, this radical picture, I think, of settler colonialism has I think, been really interesting and has really stirred some extremely important research, but it hasn't met with universal acceptance. And I think, historians like Shino Konishi and Miranda Johnson and Tim Rouse have kind of said that what we also need alongside this kind of structural picture of the big wheels of colonies is also attention to the agency of people who are involved here, both Indigenous people who sought to find their way in a rapidly changing environment, and also Europeans who had differing viewpoints and opinions regarding the Aboriginal people that they met. So that is to say that we want to kind of capture, I think, that complexity, that sort of tension between the inescapable fact that Europeans came here forever to stay at the expense of those who used to be here forever. But on the other hand, in doing so, there were contradictions and difficulties and arguments about the way in which this process should unfold. And so we wanted to capture that complexity, particularly with regard to the Germans. So the sources presented in this book reflect, I think, the complexities of colonisation and frontier relations, but also the differences within the German population that settled in South Australia. And of course, I think Peter's briefly mentioned, and all of you would know that we have the old Lutherans, we have the 48ers, we have the variety of anthropologists and scientists and simple travellers that come out here, all of whom experience the colony in very, very different ways, and all of whom have very different things to say about the Indigenous people that they met. So we want to again capture complexity, because I think in complexity that's when we can really start to unravel and unpick some of the harder themes related to truth-telling. So to just kind of wrap all of this up very quickly, the Germans, I think, who wrote about the First Nations people of South Australia did so, of course, from a wide range of positions. And so in some ways we're dealing with a fiction here, you know, German approaches to Indigenous people and German views of it, because they're so disparate that in many ways that they defy an attempt to sort of aggregate them. Some of these, of course, were settlers, some of them were anthropologists and scientists, some of them were missionaries, and they came here bringing their own understandings of what they were doing here and what they should do to stay here or not, as they saw fit. Together, however, they were instrumental in shaping understandings of Australia's First Nations peoples in the German-speaking world, and that's something we sometimes forget, that a whole kind of way of seeing Australia in Europe was created by some of these writings. But they also, as Peter said, they also affected the way in which Australians themselves, British settlers, saw Indigenous people as well in their interactions, either by reading each other's writings or through their conversations with one another. So, of course, the accounts we have here are filled with inaccuracies and misunderstandings, and in some cases just simple disregard or even contempt for Indigenous people. We don't shy away from that sad reality, but it's, I think, in some ways because of the often forgotten influence of their views, that they really require study so we can kind of get a sense of what these frontier encounters were like. So the record of these Germans and interactions with Indigenous peoples, I think, represent an important and perhaps rarely glimpsed view of the history of European colonisation in South Australia. Certainly not one that's that is foregrounded in more traditional forms of commemoration and history. The impressions of Indigenous life make the racial complexion of frontier relations in South Australia in some ways more intelligible. We can understand where some of the later problems arose at their moment of inception. And I think hopefully in the chapters of the book, we can reveal both the reasoning that motivated the search for avenues of intercommunal understanding that you see, for example, with people like Sherman and Teichmann and others, but also where we find the callous indifference and offhanded racism of those in the name of kind of Europeanisation and civilisation assumed that there was some kind of historical necessity and inevitability about the demise of those who had lived in southern Australia since time immemorial. And the very fact, of course, that we have that these Indigenous nations have survived to the present, I think, in many ways defied the expectations of many of the people whose writings we have here. So I hope you'll accept the book, warts and all, with the good and the bad, and find something, if not, you may not find too many heartwarming reads in it, but nonetheless, I think you'll find certainly something that will help us understand how we came to be here in South Australia in the present moment. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to Jeff, and I hope you enjoy the book is not quite the word, but I hope you'll find something in there that is worth investigating further.
Just working, yes. So thank you to both our speakers. That will give people an opportunity to ask questions, and if you can wait until I get the microphone to you, and these two gentlemen will use the other microphone here, because one of the problems we've experienced with people watching it online is if we don't use a microphone, they can't hear what's being asked or said. So is there any questions anybody would like to ask? Done too well. Oh, sorry, Christine.
You talked about representing a variety of attitudes towards Aboriginal people. Did you find, or do you feel, that these views were very much different from what the British were expressing?
I didn't find anything in there that startled me as uniquely German in the sense of attitudes. I think there was a broader, I suppose in some ways, pan-European approach to the world outside of Europe, and certainly that was shared. What I think was more common was to see similarities between people who had similar missions. So that is to say, British and German anthropologists found common ground, and to some extent, and I hesitate a little here, British and German missionaries had similar understandings of what in the long term should happen. Now, there were confessional differences, there were different views on language and language use, for example. German Lutherans, of course, famously being very stout in their defence of the use of German language with their communities. But in the broadest sense, I didn't see I saw very few hints that the Germans were either better predisposed or worse in their views than the British. That would be my sense of it. Peter may have other views, I'm not sure.
One interesting question I'd like to ask is, was there any effect of the publication of Darwin's Origin of the Species it changed the attitude of people to the native people, to the native, the original Aboriginal people?
Difficult to give a straightforward answer to that one. What I would say is that the theory of evolution wasn't as widely accepted among Germans as it was in the Anglo tradition. So yes, there are some examples of Germans who embraced that way of thinking, but it was less common there, and I think that underlines the point that Matt was making and that we've both been making, I think, is that there is this great variety among the Germans. And that's one of the challenges, I think, as Matt was alluding to, that there might be a temptation in looking at a German intellectual tradition to say that let's start with the 1930s, 1940s and work backwards, when in fact in the 19th century lots of intellectual traditions are at play, so it's very difficult to limit it to simply one. There are lots that are coexisting. We can find some broader trends, perhaps, on the point of language. I think that's an important one, that you find that quite commonly, that among Germans, in many cases, there's a kind of humanist bent that says that what they want to do is try to understand these people who are foreign to them, and how do you go about understanding the other? For the physical anthropologist, it's about measuring bodies, and that is one approach that is pursued. But then what occurs quite commonly is the kind of approach that says what we need to do is understand the way people think. We need to jump inside their mental world. How do we do that? Well, we need to understand their languages, we need to understand their concepts, we need to understand their culture. And so there are those Germans, and that's a very common thing, who take upon themselves that task of climbing into trying to explore the mental world of the other. And now whether they do that successfully is a moot point perhaps, but that's their intellectual starting point, that to understand the other they have to undertake to set for themselves that task of understanding the mental world of other people.
Okay, another question?
Really. Well, I mean, we're really interested, I think, in hearing maybe the words of some of these Germans. And I'm wondering whether you have a favourite passage which illuminates these attitudes, not the negative ones necessarily, but I'm thinking of some of the insights that Teitelman arrived at for the different subgroups of the Adelaide people, Adelaide Plains people, and particularly their relationship to clan or group ownership of particular tracts of land. These are issues that the British hadn't really got a handle on, I think. So there's that question. And secondly, I'm wondering whether Bazadow, for example, he wasn't included. Do you have others who eluded you and their texts are perhaps still sleeping in some German archive? Those are my questions.
Yeah, there were some that ended up on the cutting room floor. Among the missionaries, for example, we had Julius Kuhn there for a while. We didn't have a substantial text. We found a newspaper article and we were toying with the idea of using that, but abandoned it along the way. I do remember Lois, I think, handing to us a catalogue that related to the Bethesda mission, and that's a job for someone to do at some point. You know, there's a lot of material there. Otto Siebert was one we didn't include there, but quite interesting case. There was fairly technical work by linguists, just to return to that point about the German interest in linguistics. So there's some Planert, I think, was one who did linguistic work in Central Australia. So there were those texts which were quite technical that we didn't include. And in the case of Krause, we didn't include much. We included the first few pages which sort of set up his study and where he talked about where he'd sourced all of these crania from, so some from South Australia, but from other parts of Australia as well. So there's certain things that we thought were just too technical by nature, that they weren't appropriate for this kind of anthology. Maybe in terms of your first question, and Matt might have an idea or two, but it's quite an interesting passage at the end of the Neumeier piece, because what I see there is an attitude towards Indigenous people that goes against the grain to some extent. I mean, I think he accepts the view that was very widely held among British settlers as well, that Indigenous people were destined to extinction, and yet he wants to affirm the intellectual and the moral qualities of them. So perhaps I can just read a few words from the conclusion to that piece. As I said at the beginning, my only objective was to give a picture of this highly peculiar, so much maligned and so lowly placed race from my experience in an intellectual, if you like, in a moral respect, which may perhaps help to give a more correct idea of the position of the Australians among rational beings. If I have succeeded in this, and even if I have perhaps given the impetus for a more competent force among you to examine the matter on scientific grounds before it is too late and the whole tribe recedes into oblivion, then I have achieved more than I dared to hope. But I find my satisfaction especially in the fact that before an assembly so competent in questions of the physical and intellectual condition of mankind, I became an advocate for a race which has proved useful and faithful to me on many occasions, about whom I have been able to report no significant complaints, but only positive things.
Use it. Very, very briefly, looking at Sherman, for example, which I think most people would say he would be one of the more well predisposed Germans in terms of his relations with Indigenous people. And yet, when you read the actual text, there's a kind of an ambivalence there that has to be kind of, I guess, admitted to. So he says, on the one hand, it is not unknown to us that the Aborigines of New Holland have no good reputation in Europe, as well with reference to their bodily physical condition as to their intellect, but we are not afraid to declare, at least of those we have seen, that that report is quite baseless, and those informants who brought it to pass must either have had so little knowledge of them as to be able to form a fair judgment, or may even have intended to say something striking and extraordinary. And then he goes on to say, but one will say how it is that one finds almost no signs whatever of culture among the Aborigines. So on the one hand, yes, on the other hand, no. He goes on to say elsewhere as well, let's see, by nature the natives are peaceful, friendly, kind, open, without prejudice and honest. But one quality they have which is not to be boasted about, namely laziness. So if you look at the works, even of those who are attempting to mount a case in defence of Indigenous people, quite often there's a kind of a peppering of value judgments and wholesale pronunciations on their culture and cultural state that kind of belie the actual kind of attitudes they're attempting to look at. There's one very brief one from, say, Hans Hermann Baer, who says something similar, that on the one hand he says, I will confine myself to rescuing the much maligned Australian from the accusation of a complete incapacity for education with a brutality that is comparable to that of animals, which has made the already beginning decline of the Aborigines appear desirable and necessary in the eyes of many. So that is to say here, again, there's a sense of an attempt to kind of rescue the reputation of Indigenous people. But elsewhere, of course, in there is a kind of there are kind of more ambivalent views as well. So in answer to your question, Philip, I think that even in those who are attempting to defend Indigenous people, there are kind of some fairly hair-raising assumptions about their cultural state, which of course, you know, you would imagine you would find. And then on the other hand, even amongst those who automatically assume that Indigenous people are destined to quote-unquote die out, there is nonetheless a kind of a sense that something is being lost and that something more should be done for them. So, I mean, those kinds of ambivalences, which I don't think, by the way, are unique to the German community either.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Chris?
In reference to the question about the influence of Darwin, that John Vanderhook asked, I'd just like to make one comment. Already in the 1830s, both Teichelman and Sherman reported that while they were in Germany, they were told that the Australian Aborigines were descended from orangutans. So the ideas that informed Charles Darwin's writing 20 years later were already in the air before he did any writing.
Thank you, Chris. Any other questions? If not, I'll ask Dr. Dean Sweck to come forward and give a vote of thanks.
Professor Peter Monteath and Dr. Matthew Fitzpatrick. Sorry? Professor, both professors, sorry. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. As you said at the end, you said, enjoy the book, but not quite the word. So, this is not easy. And I think takes even some courage to come and talk publicly about this topic. This is hard, and but it's so important that I think of my own ancestor who came in 1847 and was on the Gellert in that community where they built their place on a lake bed, and apparently the Aboriginal people said to them, "Oh, this is not a good place to build your place." And they were right, because it was actually a lake, and the lake filled up and they had to move. But I've often wondered, well, what interaction was there? Was it like the cover on the book, which is quite ideal, this kind of friendly interaction between some Aboriginal visitors visiting some people at their home? Or was it something else, you know? And when they wrote home to Germany, what did they say about the people? That's another level. I mean, the articles in the book, they're polished articles, but what were ordinary farmers and ordinary people, what were they writing in their letters? And, well, it's a long time ago now, but this is such an important part of our story here in this country. And this truth-telling must happen. So thank you for what you are doing. And with truth-telling, you can't have truth-telling unless you have some very careful research and digging it out and putting it in front of people. And that's what you're doing, and we thank you for that. Yeah. And also, it was an interesting talk. Congratulations. Thank you. 2 for you.
Oh.
Equal opportunity.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Dean. So, mention is made of this book different times tonight. Wakefield Press are out here tonight at the table. These books are available from them for $34.95. They've got quite a few copies there, and I commend that book to you. But thank you to the speakers. I think it's a really brave project on their part to sort of go to all this research and to document what you found and to analyse what should or should not go in the book. And so it's obvious that a lot of thought has gone into it on a perhaps controversial topic to some people, and well done to sort of present it in the way that you have said that you've done so. So I commend the book to you. Now tonight, there's a few people that I don't recognise here. Is any people here for the first time at one of our meetings? Anybody? Yes. Welcome to the meeting. And hope you found it interesting. We have 9 of these presentations per year, and you're welcome to come at any time and join in. As I said, there's only one more meeting to go next month when Sam Daring is talking about his own little community up at Neil's Flat. And I'm sure that'll also be an interesting topic. And considering how many people went to tune in to what he had to say during History Month, it's obvious that the interest spread very quickly to sort of have so many people come there, and so we hope we have a good attendance here as well. So thank you all for coming tonight, and you're most welcome to stay for supper in the church hall across the road here. And if you've got any other questions you want to ask the speakers personally, or if you want to buy a book and get them to autograph it, that's up to you. So thank you all for coming, and invite you to join us for supper.